We have with us today Ms. Cecilia Corbin Hunter. She was a member of Mayor Maynard Jackson's staff for all 3 terms. We have Jim Drinker, who's a panelist. He is presently the Assistant General Manager of Planning and Development here at the Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. We have Karen Duckett, who I did my research on, who's a phenomenal businesswoman, and she gets all the boxes checked, who is owner of Duckett Design. I'm happy to have you with us here today. We also have Walter Huntley, who is a church member of mine here in Atlanta. He is a former chief of staff and presently senior vice president and partner at CHA Consulting. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Bill Swift, who is a panelist, and he is president of Business Travelers Services, Inc.
Mayor Jackson never considered his program to be affirmative action. It was an equal economic opportunity program. And the point of that is that it was not an exclusion, it was an inclusion, it was a leveling of the playing field. It was to ensure that there was a place at the table for all in the community, not just some in the community.
Bill Swift. I started off as a special assistant through an executive internship program, eventually became the mayor's director of the mayor's office of economic development, and eventually as the director of procurement and real estate for the city of Atlanta. That meant all contracts, all supplies went through my office, which put us in a very interesting position. If you realize that the Emma Darnell was, I believe, the first director of procurement under Maynard, followed by Art Cummings, and then myself. It was a short term for each one of us to some degree. In fact, Emma became a member of City Council, Art became the Chief Operating Officer for the City of Atlanta. And as a result, we all had a perspective that I think included that the process lacked integrity. The process had to lack integrity in a city where the population was clearly more than 50% female, and nearly that in terms of minorities, yet only 1%, less than 1%. So you have to assume that the process lacked the integrity of inclusion, that there were some intentional efforts to make sure that certain people were not involved. And they set up in a way that had to be changed, but you had to have people at the top to make those changes. And that's where I think the staffing changes that Maynard imposed brought about those changes. Also, let me go one step further. The members of City Council, very independent group, had to be part of agreeing to this change. They didn't all go along with that. There was actually some kicking and screaming for what Maynard wanted to do. So his change was not only in terms of the process for contracting and the awarding of contracting and the process by selection of those who take on those contracts, but he had to convince the other body of city government that you have to agree with where I want to take this city. I'll stop on that.
What specific things did Mayor Jackson do to initiate a culture of diversity and inclusion, if you could build on that? And more directly, what did he achieve a win-win? How did he achieve a win-win between the city's traditional white economic power and its well-known black socio-political power?
My name is Walter Huntley, and I was special assistant to the mayor, started with him in 1974. I was 25 years old when I started working for Maynard, then became deputy chief administrative officer and chief of staff for his first 2 terms, and then his 3rd term I served as president of the Public-Private Development Corporation, the Atlanta Economic Development Corp, and Maynard was chairman of my board at that time. When you talk about what Maynard did in terms of inclusion, you have to realize that his campaign was built around the politics of inclusion. Maynard changed the paradigm because he understood what it was like to be excluded, and he wanted to utilize the moral authority of the office to level, as Bill said, the playing field. Now, he felt that Atlanta would be a much better city if it engaged all of the people of Atlanta. It could be a better city. And he started out from the very beginning when he took office in terms of looking at all of the boards and commissions. He felt that if we had younger people, if we had more women, if we had more black people at the table, that the Atlanta city government would be a much better government. And he instilled that throughout his staff. He was looking for new ideas, new people. At that time in 1974, 75, 76, people were flocking to Atlanta, coming into Atlanta, tremendous growth, unprecedented growth. And he felt as if he needed to tap the ideas of the people. And so that's why he brought in, for example, he created the Atlanta Fellows Program. That's how Bill Swift came. That's how Ingrid Jones came from Detroit. I came from San Antonio, Texas. And he wanted to bring people in to really tap into their ideas. He felt that the city would be much better if we could utilize these new ideas. So he started the NPU, Neighborhood Planning Unit process, the free jazz concerts in the city, bringing more people in. Those types of things, I think, were just a hallmark of Maynard Jackson's initial move into city government, and he had that with him that started from day one.
I worked under Maynard from 1974 to 1977. He was my last employer. After Maynard, I went and became a free moving consultant and then a business owner. And that was the last time in 1978 I ever worked for an employer other than my firm. But what he did is, while Walt and Cecilia and Bill were more at the policy level, I was the physical development administrator, and then a title, which meant that I managed all of the non-housing community development block grant funds. And it was a wonderful way, and one of the things that we saw and did was to find ways to bring that inclusion to fruition, to basically put in place the policy that was set up. And so through the Community Development Block Grant Program, what happened with the Urban Development Action Grant Program, which was actually conceived as a policy in this city, with the Undersecretary of HUD, was basically one to show how we could resource manage women, at that time predominantly African Americans, and find those resources that could be put in place that would make a positive statement as to why this is such a necessary policy. Everybody knew it was necessary, but you had to have the right resources to show how well it can be done. And so my job was, with this $47 million, was to develop contracts and contract relationships that would be utilized that basically showcased the quality of minority development.
It's what MBDA as an agency strives for. We conduct studies through the U.S. Census Bureau, and the new reports will be coming out very shortly, first part of next year, but just about all of our corporate partners use our studies to make the business case for their diversity and inclusion programs, because, again, we can talk about data, and we could talk about anecdotally what actually happens in day-to-day life and what we experience. But typically, what you will find is if you're talking to a group of decision makers, you have to quantify what it really means economically and how it impacts their bottom line. And so that's what the data does, and that's what we do at MBDA. But this question is specifically for you. Two of the barriers to successful small business development, even today, are access to capital and bonding. How, in your opinion, did Mayor Jackson attack these two elements some 40 years ago?
Being a professional design firm, the issue of bonding, I'm going to pass it on to two great concessionaires, has not been that great an issue. Because we deal in professional liability insurance, and that's sort of like being, if you're familiar with doctors and lawyers, architects and engineers have to carry professional liability insurance. If we have the contract and the contract has a value, we are basically, they'll sell us the insurance, which is an after-the-fact insurance process. You don't have to put it in before the fact. So it's a little bit easier to do, that I think, than bonding is. And having been on some of the construction side, it can be a great challenge, because if you don't have the past performance, it's starting that new kid on the block, then you find that you have a challenge with it. And again, for us, it was finding and establishing relationships, not only for us, and this is something I think we've all done, is establishing a relationship that, yes, works for Duckett Design Group, but it also works for who's coming behind me, or who I want to sponsor, or a concessionaire that I think is valuable, so that I can give those kinds of resources, and I can give, say, here, call John Doe. Because John Doe is sensitive to that kind of a relationship, and that's what's important.
Did you find that teaming and joint venturing was it on the horizon? Was it on the uptick at that time? Because at that time, a lot of companies did not necessarily have the capacity, whether it was capacity for bonding or capacity for bidding on these municipal procurements? Okay.
Since the program was a business stabilization, it was an economic development program, the mayor engaged the business community to solve the obstacles. And that's what we need our communities doing today, so that concessionaires and others working at the airport can get the capital that they need. The compliance department and the procurement department walk in different arenas in contracting services. When there is a barrier, as there was in '74 and in subsequent years, the compliance department worked with the insurance community as well as the banking community to get them engaged and to have them buy into this new program. That was how he was able to creatively engage the community to assist in providing the funding needed by the previously underemployed small contractors. In addition, the community became engaged and reaped the benefits of the program, because as each minority contractor became a more viable employer, the community itself benefited as well.
One thing he imposed was a pre-qualification process. And by pre-qualifying, in effect, they were putting out a series of criteria for every major contract. And that list had to include, of course, your experience, your financial capability, and your participation program. How are you going to include women and minorities in this? And how are you going to financially structure it so that they could participate? So he did kind of a, if you will, a backdoor approach to making those who want to go after those contracts present what their program was up front, by saying who was going to be on their team, how they're going to play, how they're going to make sure that if there was a bonding issue, how you were going to address it. Once you went through the pre-qualification process, then you were permitted to bid. That was a huge change and benefit to the overall program, and he did it on every level, and especially for the large contracts. And it allowed, in effect, the city to put out a contract that might be for $10 or $20 million. There was no minority company at the time that may have qualified for it. But the major players said, I can bid for it, the 5 or 6 companies, and let me impress you with how I'm going to include women and minorities. And if I got past that, then I was allowed to bid. Then it was down to a dollar amount, not based on whether it was women or minorities involved, because we already approved you for that. That's a very important part and something to consider for those areas of the country that still having difficulty with it. How do you make that happen when you don't have the laws or the regulations to support it? Maynard didn't have the laws to support a major inclusion of women and minorities. He did it by saying, we're going to make it fair to everybody, but we want to see how you're going to present the inclusion.
From communities or airports that are represented here today, if they wanted to emulate the legacy of Mayor Jackson, what would be your advice to them, and how would they go about it?
Well, let me start by saying, now we have sufficient examples of how to do it. And we have regulations that support how to do it, barring those states that have changed the laws that make it difficult today. But there are enough places in this country that the federal regulation or city ordinance or approach to inclusion have been well established. Just go to that city and copy it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have enough information out there that some of the communities that don't have a robust participation program can create one and improve it based on where others have already started, as opposed to saying, let me go and reinvent the wheel. You don't have to today.
I would say, in addition to what Bill said, you have to, first of all, acknowledge that you have a problem and that you're going to be proactive about improving the existing situation. And basically, it gets back to leadership. Your leadership in your various communities, that's the key. You've got to develop a plan. As Bill said, you build on what's already there on the books, but look at your respective communities, and then you have to get the buy-in, the political, the community, the business, etc. Find out what it's going to take, and then begin to execute. And then see where you are. That's one thing about Maynard and his administration. At the end of a year, we'd look back and see how good we were doing. Did it work? What needed to be tweaked? As Bill indicated before, Maynard understood that he understood the business risk. He didn't just pull a goal out of the air or anything like that. He had these creative minds sitting, working, thinking, trying to figure out the best way to make economic justice a reality within this city.
There are stories that some of the closed-door negotiations between Atlanta's traditional power brokers and Mayor Jackson's agents of change were not always peaches and cream. Some might even say contentious and stormy. Yet, once both parties came from behind the door, they were on one accord. Can any one of you, and I'd like for you to do this, Jim, share some of the war stories from the 70s and 80s?
That's clearly not the question we rehearsed. No. That's okay. Let me take a shot at that. By the way, because in preparing for this panel, you can tell I'm not old enough to have lived what they're talking about. So I went to school with some of my historians that brought me into this program, and it made for a fascinating set of phone calls I've been to just kind of relive that part of my professional life, or just before it. By way of background, I joined Hartsfield as a consultant in August of 1977 with a joint venture known as Atlanta Airport Engineers, which was a joint venture of Howard Needles, Tamman and Bergendoff, HNTB, and Robert and Company of Atlanta. And that was the engineering consortium that was set up to do all the engineering for the midfield complex. There was a separate joint venture set up to do the architectural piece, but we had the civil engineering part. So when I got there in 1977, a lot of the rough and tumble you asked about had already happened in the boardrooms. what I was told was that there was nothing subtle about it. There was no hand-holding, singing Kumbaya. The mayor of Atlanta said, you're going to play or you're going to leave. And the goal, as I was told, was originally set at 25%. And the mayor compromised to 20 to 25% is what I was told. You guys live that. Where I saw it affect me in my professional life was we had this nice majority joint venture doing all this design, and one day my principals came in and told me we had a third company that we were adding to our joint venture, which was Williams Russell Johnson. Now at the time the goals were set, as I was told, there really wasn't a minority engineering firm in Atlanta. And my group had to go to New York to engage a company called Ewell Finley to start that process going. But I believe Pelham Williams was the Director of Public Works for the City of Atlanta. And I don't know how that happened, but there was an opportunity there for Pelham Williams and Chuck Johnson to start a firm, and they were put on a level playing field with us. So they became a third joint venture partner at 33%, not 25%. We understood that if we wanted to keep working at the airport, that's how we were going to do business.
People who weren't used to dealing with a strong, visionary, charismatic, articulate black mayor setting a new tone, how that played, that's very important. It's very important for us to understand. And as I said before, Maynard did not just start doing stuff. He understood as a tactician and as a politician, consummate politician, that you needed to get buy-in. And I'll just give you one example about the situation. We looked at the banks and the financial community. There was no black on the board of directors of any of the banks here in Atlanta, not one. So Maynard had private meetings with each of the bank presidents for about a year initially. And then when the mayor would go talk to the president, then Art Cummings and I may go talk to one of the senior vice presidents and say, we're just following up on a conversation that the mayor had with your CEO. And those were somewhat difficult conversations because they would say, well, we just can't find anybody. Mm-hmm. Now, we would smile and say, this is the Center for Black Private Education in the United States, Morehouse, Atlanta University. You mean to tell me you can't find one qualified black person to not only be on the board, but be in upper management positions? So those were not comfortable discussions, but they needed to take place. After about a year, when there was no movement whatsoever on any of the board branches, Maynard called Charlie Davis in, who was the finance director. He said, Charlie, and the city had money in all the banks, and they moved one bank each year had the majority of the money, and it rotated around. He said, how much money we have in X bank? And he said, well, we have so much. And he said, you know, Tom Cordy was placed on the board of one of the banks, I think it was First Union. He said, why don't you move $200,000 from First Union, from this bank into First Union? And he said, well, Mr. Mayor, we hadn't done that before. And he said, I don't care, just do it. He moved the money. Within a year, every bank had one director. They got the message. There was no rancor. It all had gotten done.
Consider a guy that graduated at 16. He graduated from college. He was a very bright guy, very quick on the uptake. He realized what it was to have power and how to use it. And I recall being his special assistant, and one afternoon he says, Bill, I want you to come to this meeting with me. I'm going to show you how to use power. Of course, it was an education. I walked into this meeting with Dan Sweat of Central Atlanta Progress, the senior vice president of CNS Bank. He had Felker Ward, Jesse Hill, and two others. And I don't think it was Georgia Power, but it was somebody like that in the room. They were in there to chastise him about what he had decided in terms of economic development for the city's role in economic development. He said, this is what these folks are expecting to get from me. So I'm going to show you how you make a difference. Like I walked in there, went to each person around the table, eyeball to eyeball, and shook their hand and said, I'm glad you're here. I want you to help me to get something done. Each one, he said exactly the same thing to them. All of a sudden, they felt like, why am I here? Because he's telling me what he wants me to do for him. We're here to chew on his neck. Well, at the end of the meeting, and one more thing, when Maynard sat down, he said, all right, gentlemen, let's sit down, let's get started. Here's my agenda. He went 1, 2, 3, and now how are you going to help me to get that done? And point a finger at these guys. That made a huge difference in their response, because they're all willing to sit back and throw stones at Maynard, but he took the position, I guess the authoritative position, of I'm in charge, this is my meeting, I am the mayor of this city, and you're going to do this collectively to get the results that we want. This approach we've had for years, including that of the airport. Now, many of you know that the airport was held in drawings for a year, because Maynard said, I'm not going to build this airport until there's inclusion. That's a huge economic machine that everybody thought was going to happen. In fact, under the Sam Massell administration, they knew for sure it was going to happen, that some of the contracts had already been prepared to be signed and executed because Massell was going to win a second term. But Maynard won. That changed things enormously. Now, I'll give you one more side note. Remember that the terminal building had carpet? Most of the hallways had carpet in it. Why would you put a carpet in a place that has that much traffic? Well, Dahlonega, right up here, Georgia, where they make carpet. Dalton, thank you. Dalton was the deal they decided, Maynard decided to let that go, to give peace of sharing the pie, if you will, rather than fighting that group that wanted to make sure the carpet was going to be, and that was a way of including the state in the development of Hartsfield. So he was a horse trader, very smart one, that realized, I don't have to win every battle, but if I win enough of it, I'll make a difference. And as most of us can tell what's going on in the city of Atlanta today, where the participation, particularly on the concession side, is nearly 40%, from a place that had less than 1% to nothing. That's a huge difference, and because one guy decided, I'm going to make a difference not just for a few people, but all the people. I'm going to see how far I can include as many as I possibly can. He didn't have enough friends to accommodate 25% of the activity he pitched. And some of us realize that it takes a person who goes beyond themselves and say, I'm doing this for everyone because it'll make a difference in this city. And it absolutely has.
Incredible political and business savvy. He knew how to work the system. He had a voice. He stood firm. He didn't waver, and he held the decision makers, he held them accountable. And he was an agent of change. At the heart and core of what he stood for was change, and change economically for people of color, I would say in general, but naturally African Americans, because that was who he was. But also inclusion comprehensively. And so the challenge that we face today as business owners is the demographic shift is changing. And so when we look at programs such as set-aside programs, the SBA's 8A programs, other public as well as private sector programs that are targeted at MBEs, the argument that we sometimes hear these days is, well, the minority is now the majority. And we're not just talking about in sheer numbers, but my personal argument is the economic side of the equation, because he who controls the dollar controls the economics. So while the numbers may be changing, what are the supply chains looking like? And so that's what Maynard stood for. He wanted to make certain that the economic side of the equation was there, and we weren't just measuring the formula based on sheer numbers. So what I'd like to have the panelists talk a little bit about is for those organizations that are having a tough time meeting their goals, or in the instance that you stated, used to be stated, we have cast a net, and I would say we hear that right now all the time. I get calls at the end of the fiscal year from federal partners with fire drill money. Oops, we've got $250 million, we've got to spend it now, help. You know, we need to meet our goals, we're failing grossly, help us out. How have you been able to help some of these companies, whether through joint ventures, where you may be, for example, the prime and they the sub, and vice versa? Have you seen that a lot in your businesses, and do you have any insight you can share on that level?
Well, let me offer this. The first aspect is to recognize, one, that this conference is hosted by Airport Minority Advisory Council. It's been in place for over 30 years, promoting inclusion all over the country. It is an excellent way, such as a conference like this, to bridge the gap or bring people together, whether it's a prime to a sub or a minority to a majority. This lays the foundation for that kind of activity. And if you're not a member of AMAC, then I would suggest you become a member of AMAC and come to events like this, where we not only talk about how to do it, but where the opportunities are. Significant amount of business takes place at these conferences. We talked to one of the majority firms that came to an AMAC conference 3 or 4 years ago, and in 6 months had generated $12 million of new business as a majority firm because they teamed with a minority firm that had access and understood, but it came as a result of participating in Airport Minority Advisory Council. So I'm pitching for the organization. I've been a long-time member and a member of the board, and I know it has worked. And in fact, many of the airport executives, general managers, second tier, third tier, are members of AMAC, and they come to this event willing to listen and hear what can be done to make inclusion a better place.
I like the fact that the point that Bill made with regard to when Maynard had the qualification criteria, where you would have companies submit pretty much what's comparable to a capability statement. That way, you know exactly what the core competencies of the companies were or are, so that when you look at the opportunities, the procurement or contract opportunities that are being put forth, you know what you're marrying up, and it doesn't waste anybody's time. So I think that's a wonderful best practice for those of you that are here from other airports and authorities that are looking for how can we put forward opportunities, business development opportunities for MBEs to engage. And you did them twice a year, you were saying? I don't know if AMAC does that, but I think AMAC coupled with the other partners, that would be a wonderful platform. What was Maynard Jackson's inspiration or passion, and who do you feel was his mentor or hero in these trying times?
Maynard came from a strong family. His grandfather was his mentor, John Wesley Dobbs. His father was a Baptist minister. His mother and his aunts were all educators, all educated at Spelman College. So he came from a family that cared about its children, cared about its community. His grandfather created the Georgia Voters League. So as a young person, he was given instruction on what his role was in life. He understood his role, it became his purpose, and he lived it. Not some days, not occasionally, but every day.
John Wesley Dobbs, it's not like he just said, well, my grandfather was a great guy. When we would travel on airplanes, and I would be with him for an extended period of time, he would tell me the same things that his grandfather told him about politics, about business, about networking, things of that nature. He was a Morehouse man to the day he died, and he would always talk about, if we were in a city, we need to talk to so-and-so. He's a Morehouse man. If I can't be there, I want you to talk to him. Let him know what we're doing in Atlanta, so on and so forth. So in addition to his family, he was a student of government, and he was involved, just like you're here at AMAC, he was involved in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, the Georgia Association of Black Elected Officials. He was actively engaged with the issues of his time and was interacting with the leadership, with mayors all across the country, elected officials, governors, trying to understand what is the best form of urban governance. And that's basically what his passion was.
A man who did not believe that things were impossible. He believed things were possible if it was for the good of the order.
I don't know if you caught what Bill said a few minutes ago. There was a point when Midfield was trying to get off the ground when Maynard stopped it, right? There were drawings being prepared. I was reminded last night in my conversation that the original design for the Midfield complex, everybody was trying to copy Dallas and Kansas City. You wanted your car to be close to your gate. So the first vision for the midfield was a series of terminals going west to east with a road running down the middle where you could stop at your gate, basically like you would in Dallas or Kansas City. That eventually started evolving in, well, let's don't put a road, let's put a train, and it was going to be an open trench with a train. And then the story goes that because Dallas was doing this and they had an ice storm and the train got stopped and the airport shut down, that wasn't going to be a good idea. Well, during that year is when what we built finally got planned by the planners. The series of parallel concourses with a covered spine and a walkway in the middle, so if the train wasn't working, you could walk between concourses. So that pregnant pause that we took actually led to the most efficient airport design in the world.
And I just want to add to what they both said about thinking big and thinking what is possible. We wouldn't have the most efficient airport. It didn't come easy because of the fact when you go down 85 South, you know how 85 kind of takes that curve and then it goes around. This was the first time we ever, when they showed the plans to Maynard, he said, well, I think we ought to have this access for this runway and so forth. And they said, well, we can't do that because you have to move an interstate. And he said, and they said it's never been done in the history of the United States. No one's done that at the local level. He said, well, we'll just have to do it. That's the only way we're going to get this done. And, everybody just kind of shook their heads. And he said, well, Walt, let's go see the head of the Department of Transportation. So most people don't realize that Maynard is a consummate marketer and seller. I mean, he always prided himself as being a bookman. He says, I'm a bookman. He used to sell encyclopedias. But he would, so we went up to the Department of Transportation. He got his congressional delegation together, talked to them, said, look, if we do this, if we move this interstate highway, this will make Atlanta one of the premier cities, not only in the United States, but in the world. We'll be able to put more gates here, and we'll be able to get to 80% of the U.S. population in 2.5 hours. And I went with him to those meetings, and he sold it. But it was a heavy lift. But it just gets back to Seal's point about thinking big and thinking that you can accomplish whatever needs to be done regardless of the obstacles.
And last but not least in all of this, not only did he think big, not on the particular issue, but it was a residual approach. He always did trickle down. And my first meeting with him when I first was hired by the city, my first job was to relocate a community called Mountain View. Mountain View was a black community that sat on the other side of I-75. They had no running water. This is 1974. No running water, no indoor plumbing. The planes went over them every 42 seconds. And they needed to go. And so using community development block grant funds, we relocated this community. And of course, I come in and I said, yes, Mr. Mayor, you wanted to meet with me. He says, how fast can you get these people out? And how good can you get them new housing? So it started off with a desire to build the best airport, to be inclusionary in who created that airport, but also to give a residual to benefit people who probably were completely ignored by any other organization as to getting them into a better quality of living. So yes, unfortunately, Maynard's switch was always on, and that may be why we lost him too soon. But he was always on it. He was always thinking of doing it just a little bit better each time.
And from what I've heard today, Mr. Chairman, I would like to put it on the record that based on what I have attested to from the panelists and what we are in the movement of doing at MBDA to champion and be the champion of minority business enterprise at the federal level, we would like to formalize a partnership with AMAC, and we would like to make a difference in honor of champions like Maynard Jackson with this Department of Transportation audit and highlighting some of what's going on and illuminating what's going on at the FAA. Stay tuned. Thank you.